Okay, so you know how we always talk about systems needing safeguards, like the things that keep everything fair and prevent things from going completely sideways?
Yeah, like the checks and balances we've discussed, those are super important.
Exactly, those. Well, today we're looking at a case that shines a bright light on why those safeguards, especially something called due process, are absolutely essential.
I'm intrigued already. What kind of case are we talking about?
We're going deep on Kilmar Arrigo Garcia's story. He was a legal U.S. resident. But here's the thing, he was deported even though a court order was supposed to protect him from that.
Wait, hold on. Deported despite a court order? That sounds incredibly serious. How is that even possible?
Right, that's what we're going to untangle. Our main source for this deep dive is a transcript from Glenn Kirshner's YouTube channel where he breaks this whole thing down.
Glenn Kirshner. That's a name you can trust for legal analysis. I'm ready to dive in. What's the mission here? What are we hoping to uncover?
Basically, we want to understand exactly what happened to Mr. Garcia, figure out the consequences of what seems like a major violation of due process, and think about what this all means for how our government works and the rights we have as individuals.
That's a lot to unpack, but it's so crucial. I mean, if someone can be deported despite a court order protecting them, what does that say about the system as a whole? Are those safeguards actually working?
Exactly. It raises a lot of questions. So let's start with the facts of the case. Queimar Arrigo Garcia came to the U.S. from El Salvador back in 2011. He wasn't just visiting, he was a legal resident. Then, and this is important, in 2019, a court issued an order specifically to protect him from being deported back to El Salvador.
Okay, so we have a legal resident with a court order granting him protection from deportation. That sounds pretty ironclad, right? What happened next?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? Well, here's where things take a really strange and honestly disturbing turn. Despite that active court order, Mr. Garcia was deported to El Salvador on March 15th. And the reason given by the Trump administration.
I can't even imagine. What was their explanation for this?
They said it was due to an administrative error.
An administrative error? Seriously, what kind of error could possibly lead to the deportation of someone with a court order in place? That doesn't even sound remotely plausible.
Right. I mean, when you hear administrative error, you think, oh, someone messed up a form or something. But deporting someone with a court order protecting them, that's on a whole different level.
Totally. It makes you question the legitimacy of that explanation. What kind of system allows for an administrative error of that magnitude, especially when it involves someone's fundamental rights and their entire life being uprooted?
And remember, we're not just talking about an abstract legal issue here. This is a real person with a family. Mr. Garcia was living in Maryland with his wife and their 5-year-old child. Their child has autism and is intellectually disabled, and both parents were working full-time. This situation, which was first reported by The Atlantic, has completely devastated this family.
Oh, wow, that adds a whole other layer of tragedy to this. It's heartbreaking to think about the impact on his wife and especially their child. They were building a life here, and then, just like that, it's ripped apart because of an administrative error. It's hard to even fathom the emotional toll this must have taken.
Absolutely. And to make matters even more complicated, this wasn't an isolated incident. Mr. Garcia's deportation happened during a period when the Trump administration was actively increasing deportations to El Salvador. They were sending a lot of people there, including some from Venezuela, and a lot of them ended up in the CE maximum security prison, which is known for being pretty harsh.
So this wasn't just an isolated case. It was happening within a larger context of increased deportations to El Salvador. That raises even more concerns about due process and whether individual cases were being properly assessed. It makes you wonder if there was pressure to deport people quickly without sufficient regard for their individual rights and legal protections.
And on top of that, some of the people who were deported claimed that they were falsely accused of being gang members simply because they had tattoos.
Wow. So if someone had a tattoo, they could be labeled as a gang member and deported. That's incredibly disturbing and points to the potential for serious prejudice and bias within the system.
Yeah.
You can't just assume someone's gang affiliation based on their appearance. That completely undermines the idea of a fair and impartial assessment process.
Now, after Mr. Garcia was deported, he, his wife, and their legal team fought back. They filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court in Maryland demanding that the Secretary of Homeland Security at the time, Kirstjen Nielsen, take action to get him back to the U.S. and even stop any payments being made to El Salvador for his imprisonment.
That's a powerful legal response. They're directly challenging the government's actions and demanding accountability. By demanding his return and a stop to any payments for his imprisonment, they're making it clear that they believe his deportation was illegal and are seeking immediate action to rectify the situation.
But the government pushed back with their own argument. They claimed that U.S. courts didn't actually have the authority to order Mr. Garcia's release. They even suggested that there might not be a clear legal path for him to return to the U.S.
That's a classic legal tactic, questioning the court's jurisdiction. It's basically saying, even if a mistake was made, the court might not have the power to fix it in the way the plaintiffs want.
Oh.
It often gets into complex areas of law regarding immigration and the separation of powers between different parts of the government. And the suggestion that there's no clear process for his return, that's troubling too. It could be genuine, or it could be a way to stall and avoid taking responsibility.
And then right in the middle of all this back and forth about administrative errors and whether the courts had power in this situation, the government added another layer of complexity.
Oh boy, I can only imagine. What did they bring into the mix at this point?
They alleged that Mr. Garcia was an active member of the MS-13 gang, citing some information from an unnamed source from a 2019 bond hearing.
Whoa, that's a serious accusation to throw around, especially given the context of deportations to El Salvador and the potential dangers associated with being labeled a gang member there. Did they offer any concrete evidence to support this claim?
That's the thing. Mr. Garcia's lawyers immediately and forcefully denied this allegation. They said the government has never produced any actual evidence to back it up. And the fact that it's based on information from an anonymous source raises questions about its reliability.
Absolutely. Unidentified sources can be problematic in legal proceedings because their credibility can't be properly vetted. It makes it difficult to assess the validity of the information being presented. And in a case as sensitive as this, with someone's freedom and safety at stake, relying on anonymous sources without corroborating evidence is deeply concerning. It raises serious concerns about the fairness and transparency of the process.
And to add to that, Mr. Garcia's lawyers gave his reason for leaving El Salvador in the first place. He was actually fleeing gang violence after receiving death threats during an extortion attempt against his parents.
Hold on. So he left El Salvador to escape gang violence, and is now accused of being a gang member himself after being deported back there. That's beyond ironic. It's potentially life-threatening. It makes the government's claim seem even more questionable. Why would he flee gang violence only to become involved in it later?
Exactly. The timing and circumstances just don't add up. And here's a crucial legal point. Mr. Garcia's lawyer stated that the government didn't even argue against the fact that they lacked the legal authority to deport him because of the protective order. And what's even more striking is that they never even tried to officially get that 2019 protective order lifted through the courts.
So they knew they didn't have the authority, yet they went ahead with the deportation anyway. And they didn't even bother to try to get the protective order revoked through proper legal channels. It's incredibly alarming. It suggests a blatant disregard for the court's authority and for due process as a whole.
And this brings us to the heart of the issue: due process of law. The transcript we're looking at defines it pretty simply. It's about having notice and a chance to be heard. So in Mr. Garcia's case, the fact that a court order was in place should have automatically triggered these protections before he was deported.
Absolutely. The existence of that court order should have been a red flag, a clear signal that certain procedures needed to be followed. At the very least, Mr. Garcia should have been informed that his deportation was being considered, and he should have been given a fair opportunity to present his case and argue why he should be allowed to stay in the U.S. It seems like these basic steps were completely skipped, which is a serious breach of due process.
And given Mr. Garcia's history of fleeing gang violence in El Salvador and the fact that he's reportedly now in a prison known for housing terrorists, what are the potential consequences of the situation, setting aside the government's administrative error claim for a moment?
The consequences could be dire. If he was indeed trying to escape gang violence, being deported back to that environment, especially to a high-security prison, puts him in an incredibly vulnerable and dangerous situation. And the allegations of gang affiliation, even if unsubstantiated, could further endanger him within that environment.
It's a truly frightening situation. And here's another important point. Even if those gang allegations were true, and remember, his lawyers strongly deny them and say there's no evidence, the government still acted against an existing court order. They didn't follow the proper legal procedures to challenge or overturn it. They simply ignored it. That sets a dangerous precedent.
It absolutely does. It suggests that executive power can override judicial decisions, which is a fundamental threat to the balance of power and the rule of law. It raises serious concerns about the checks and balances that are supposed to prevent this kind of overreach. And it makes you wonder, if a court order can be disregarded so easily, what does that mean for other legal protections and for the rights of individuals in general?
So this case really brings us back to that fundamental importance of constitutional guarantees and those safeguards we talked about at the beginning. When those protections are seemingly disregarded, even if it's explained away as an administrative error, it raises serious questions about the integrity of the entire system.
It's a stark reminder that those safeguards are not just abstract principles. They have real-world consequences. When they fail, people's lives are directly affected. And in this case, the stakes are incredibly high. Mr. Garcia's safety and his future are hanging in the balance.
So let's recap. Kilmar Arrego Garcia, a legal U.S. resident protected by a 2019 court order, was deported to El Salvador due to what the government claims was an administrative error. This situation highlights the vital importance of due process and the potential consequences when those protections are seemingly overlooked. It also brings up the complex interplay between the different branches of government and the potential for one branch to overstep its boundaries.
And it leaves us with some unsettling questions. What does this case tell us about the balance of power in our system? Are the mechanisms in place to protect individual rights truly effective? If a court order can be bypassed in this way, what does that mean for the integrity of our legal processes and for the countless others who rely on them for protection? These are questions that deserve our attention and continued scrutiny.
Absolutely. And as you continue to think about this, consider the long-term implications. If something like this can happen, if a court order can be so easily dismissed, what does that mean for the future of due process and the rule of law? What message does it send to those who rely on these protections? These are not just hypothetical questions. They have real-world consequences for individuals and for the very fabric of our society.